Australia's military history is more than just a collection of dates and the locations of war-ravaged battlefields. It is the stories of service and sacrifice of those who have answered the call of their country of birth or adoption and the enduring legacy they have created. Join me as we look into one of those stories. I'm your host, Ross Manuel, and welcome to I Was Only Doing My Job, Australia's Military History, a Doc Network podcast. Now let's get started. G'day friends, and welcome to episode 69 of the podcast, recorded on the 20th of August 2024. Now this episode was requested by Christine Wilton and is about her great uncle. She reached out to me on the podcast's Facebook page asking if I'd be interested in looking into his story. She then sent me 17 pages containing transcripts of letters between her great uncle and his niece. But it was how she came upon them that drew me to the story. A woman in Melbourne by the name of Abby Donald stumbled across a Facebook marketplace listing for Second World War photos and letters, and upon discovering the fate of the soldier who penned them, tracked down Christine through the Ancestry website and returned them to her. And that's what drew me to this story. But before I get started, a couple of announcements. So between the re-release of the Breaker Morant story, two things happened. The first was a continuation to that story. I ended the episode with the Adelaide City Council convening to determine if he should be included on the Adelaide War Memorial, and since the release of that episode, they have reaffirmed their stance that he should not be included. What also occurred that in those 2 weeks, the podcast charted at position number 65 on the South Korean podcast listings. It has since dropped off again, but that was an awesome discovery. So if you are from South Korea, please drop the podcast a line. I'd like to know how you guys stumbled upon it. We also received a review from the Crabman. Quote, "It's rare to get an Australian military podcast, even rarer to get one that doesn't just read off wiki," unquote. So thanks, Crabman. I genuinely appreciate the feedback. I also want to remind you all to check out our website and web store. We have the new Armoured Brigade unit patch available for purchase. The next run of the morale patch is in the works, but if you want to support the podcast, the best way to do that is to leave a review on your favorite podcast platform of choice. It lets the algorithms know that this podcast needs to be heard by other people. But with that out of the way, let's get started. Leopold Claude Herbert Roberts was born on the 23rd of June 1912 in Yarrawonga, on the border of Victoria and New South Wales, to Joseph Richard Roberts and Maud Veronica Nee Hartley. Known as Claude, he was the second youngest of 5 children to the couple. The family stayed in the district and by 1925 had moved to a property known as Roseneath, roughly 11 miles from Woollahra in New South Wales, where sadly his mother took her own life when he was 13. At this point, the care of the younger children fell to his eldest sister, Mary Olivia Walsh, who was married to William Matthew Walsh of Hay, who would go on to serve in the garrison forces of the internment camp in Hay. At the commencement of the Second World War, Roberts was working as a farm labourer at Savernake Station when he presented to the Caulfield Recruitment Station on the 4th of July 1940, listing his father as his next of kin. While on his attestation paperwork he listed no previous military experience, in a letter written to his father he indicated that he had some connection to the 58th 59th Infantry Militia Battalion, as he mentioned that a lot of the officers and NCOs of the training battalion he was assigned to were members that he already knew. He underwent a period of training in Shepparton, Victoria with D Company of the 15th Infantry Training Battalion, and while in camp he wrote to his niece Maudie, letting her know that he was recovering from a cough, and commented that she didn't need to knit him a jumper as he was finally being issued a woolen pullover and, quote, "They are pretty good, so don't bother about it," unquote. He also inferred that he'd requested extended leave and desired to meet the family before he shipped out. On his return from leave, he was posted to the 2nd 21st Training Battalion in October for being taken on strength with C Company of the 2nd 14th Australian Infantry Battalion as part of the 21st Australian Infantry Brigade, 7th Australian Division, on the 12th of October 1940. The unit itself was only raised on the 26th of April that year. After additional training, Roberts and the rest of the 2nd 14th boarded trains on the 16th of October, bound for Sydney. The Victorian members of the battalion were, quote, "favourably impressed with New South Wales trains," unquote, when they had to change trains at the New South Wales-Victorian border at the border town of Albury-Wodonga. Apparently, large crowds lined the railway line to see the contingent off. And arriving in Pyrmont, Sydney, the battalion was disembarked and immediately berthed aboard the venerable transport and veteran of both world wars, the converted armed mariner, the Cunard White Star Line steamliner, the RMS Aquitania. The following morning, Roberts and the rest of the 2nd 14th joined the convoy comprising of HMAS Perth and the Grey Ghost herself, the RMS Queen Mary, as part of the same convoy that delivered matron Kathleen Annie Louise Best and the 2nd 5th Australian General Hospital as covered back in episode 63. While at sea, the first issuance of Australian Compass Funds parcels were also handed out, and it comprised of 1 towel, 1 pair of khaki shorts, 1 pair of pajamas, 1 pair of underwear, 2 pairs socks, 1 athletic singlet, 2 writing pads with accompanying envelopes, 1 cake saltwater soap for bathing, 1 cake laundry soap for washing clothes, 2 handkerchiefs, and 1 copy of Australian Soldier's Pocketbook, which was a 125-page red leather book that contained useful information for Australian soldiers, and definitely not something that I've been trying to get my hands on myself. These comforts were greatly appreciated by the men, which actually says a lot about the quality of the kit the AIF was issued when they first departed. As the convoy passed Cape Otway, the southernmost tip of Victoria, it gave the 2nd 14th their last glimpse of home, and for some, it'd be the last time they see it. For most of those aboard, it was actually the first time they ever saw Victoria from the sea. Roberts wrote to his niece, regaling her of stories of visits to the quote-unquote talkies on board, and commenting that while he had become seasick, a lot of those aboard were. This is corroborated by the 2nd 14th Unit Diary, which stated by the 24th of October, approximately 20% of the entire battalion was afflicted. After putting into Fremantle on the 25th of October to take on provisions and additional troops from the 2nd 16th Australian Infantry Battalion, the convoy departed for the war 2 days later. Time was spent occupied with sporting competitions and in particular intercompany boxing tournaments and familiarization with Arabic and Hebrew phrases. On the 1st of November, the convoy crossed the equator, which warranted the customary court of King Neptune, and Roberts, like many of his fellow tadpoles, was, as evidenced by photos sent home to his family, inducted in the Ancient Order of the Deep. 3 days later, the convoy put into Bombay Harbour, India. The Australian forces were then transferred ashore, and once unloaded, Queen Mary, Mauretania, and Aquitania turned around to take wounded soldiers and Italian prisoners back to Australia. For the Australians, they had apparently a pleasant week at the Delalai Rest Camp where they waited for troop ships to arrive to continue their transit. The Delalai Transit Camp was established by the British Army in 1861 to serve as accommodation for newly arrived soldiers waiting for transport to Britain. It was directly connected to Bombay Harbour by a train line, and while conditions were considered poor, particularly by those who had to spend long periods of time there, by the Second World War, facilities at the camp sported cinemas, swimming pools, amusement parks, and restaurants to serve as a distraction. And when the Australian troops arrived, it was promptly established in the unit diary that Melbourne beer was now available on tap. While in India, Roberts wrote to his niece informing her that he was going to be sending home Christmas presents, enjoying the local weather but lamenting that he hadn't received any mail from home since leaving the Puckapunyal training camp back in Victoria. For the men of the 2nd 14th, their week in India was an uneventful one, save for one tent apparently catching fire and burning down due to the release of local fireworks, though I didn't see any mention of who actually lit the fireworks. On the 9th of November, the battalion returned to Bombay Harbour and boarded the HMT Dawara, but would not be until 2 p.m. on the 12th of November they would actually leave India. In the meantime, groups of Australian troops were still allowed to depart the ship for final visits to tourist attractions, as well as commemorating Remembrance Day on the 11th. The remaining journey from India to the Suez Canal was apparently rather pleasant, with almost daily concert parties broken down by periods of training and the arrival and departure of various warships and other troop ships heading for Egypt. As they neared the Gulf of Suez, the troops started to encounter the first vestiges of the war, with distant battle sounds, the remnants of smoke screens, and air raid drills. On the 24th of November, the Dilwara entered the Suez Canal, and as the convoy entered Lake Tisma, they passed the monument dedicated to Anzac forces defending the canal against Turkish forces in 1915, and finally reached El Kantara and Port Said the following day. From there, they boarded trains for Gaza, eventually arriving at the Julius camp in eastern Palestine at 5:40 p.m. The arrival of the second raising of the Australian Imperial Force in Egypt caused a great deal of consternation amongst the Egyptian population, filled with memories of their father's notoriety for heavy drinking and debaucherous behaviour in the bars and brothels of Cairo, which actually forced the Commander-in-Chief, Middle East, General Sir Archibald Wavell, to issue a promise that this time the Australians would be better behaved. Now, despite this, the Egyptian government insisted on the relocation of Australian troops for training outside of Egyptian territory. Now, this is despite the fact that they were mandated to defend the Suez Canal, which you can't do if you're not in Egypt. The remainder of November was spent training with equipment that would have been familiar to the Australian troops who served in the region in the previous war, and often in the same camps their predecessors trained in, albeit that training took place during the rainy season. Unfortunately, the events occurring in Europe caused the supplies bound from England to not arrive, as they were simply needed back home due to the German attack through the Ardennes forest, threatening the British Expeditionary Force, which led to the evacuation of Allied personnel at Dunkirk a week after the arrival of the first contingents of Australian troops arriving in the Middle East. At the end of November, instructions were then issued to transfer unit patches from their greatcoats to their hatbands of their slouch hats, as well as concerns related to security from local population, with orders issued that their rifles had to be tied to their wrists while they slept with the bolt removed and planted so to stop their theft, which wasn't actually resolved until the following month when secure storage facilities were installed. As the men trained, they also set to work improving the conditions of their camp as they did, with the opening of a cinema with daily different films, hairdressers, tailors, laundry, and so-called quote-unquote fancy goods being made available to every unit, supplemented with electricity and working plumbing supplied to all permanent structures, which would have been a luxury considering these things weren't generally routine even in Australia. The battalion spent the entirety of December training and visiting nearby historical cities, including Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. In the new year, the men of the 2nd 14th celebrated the stellar success of their brother soldiers of the 6th Division, and in particular the 16th, 17th, and 19th Australian Infantry Brigades, for their capture of Bardia and subsequently Tobruk in January and the capture of Benghazi in February, whose counts I've covered in previous episodes, which greatly improved the morale of the 21st Brigade. The lessons learned by the 6th Division and by their involvement in 13 Corps' drive westward were scrutinised by the officers of the brigade who wanted a clear picture of those successes had been achieved, with the remainder of January and February being devoted to imparting those lessons on the still very inexperienced 7th Division as training shifted to brigade-level exercises in the use of support weapons like Bren guns and anti-tank rifles, and the importance of quickly embussing and debussing from tanks and universal carriers. On the 2nd of March 1941, Lieutenant General Archibald Wavell, Commander-in-Chief Middle East, launched Operation Luster, which saw the aptly named Luster Force being deployed to Greece to assist Hellenic forces in resisting the Axis thrust, and as the 6th Division was boarding transports in Egypt, the 2nd 14th was still undertaking training, with word reaching the battalion to prepare to move to a new camp at Derma in north and eastern Gaza on the 12th. While there, they continued to train, culminating with brigade exercises on the 22nd until the end of that month. 2 days before the German forces invaded Greece on the 5th of April, the battalion was undertaking classification practices at the Jaffa Range Camp, which were then immediately recalled back to Dimra on the 8th to prepare to move out the following day. Initially proceeding by road, the battalion boarded trains and proceeded to Alcantara, where they had to wait as the Royal Navy aircraft carrier HMS Eagle was transiting the Suez Canal. After crossing the canal, they continued to the Itingi Marut outside of Alexandria to prepare to board transports to join their brothers of the 6th Division in Greece. Erwin Rommel would change all that. Following the collapse of Italian forces in North Africa back in February, Italian dictator Benito Mussolini requested assistance from his German allies while hurriedly sending armoured forces to try and halt the British westward advance. Now, initially Hitler only sent a single panzer division under the command of one of his most trusted commanders, Erwin Rommel, to support the Italians, but due to the discrepancy in numbers, the burden of most of the fighting was still going to be on the shoulders of the Italian forces. That was, of course, until Operation Luster started, with the most experienced Commonwealth troops, including the 6th Australian Division and the British 7th Armoured Division, being relocated from the theatre, and with the Australians in Greece, the British back in Egypt, the troops that replaced them were largely inexperienced, including the newly arrived Australian 9th Division. Initially, Rommel had been ordered to simply hold the line against the Allies and to conduct armoured reconnaissance to probe the Allied defensive positions in support of the Italians. But as he realised the strategic opportunity that presented himself in March following the start of Operation Luster, turned that initial action into a full-fledged offensive through March and April, forcing the Allies back towards Egypt, and in doing so, cut the 9th Division off at Tobruk. What would become the Siege of Tobruk started 2 days after the 2nd 14th left the Dimra camp, and while the bulk of German and Italian forces isolated Tobruk, a smaller German force continued eastward. This rapid approaching threat caused a sudden and drastic strategic shift that would doom the Greek campaign, as instead of boarding transports to support the 6th Division, the 7th Division, the 2nd 14th was a part of, was rushed into positions to try and halt Rommel's advance. Claude Roberts and the 2nd 14th occupied positions at the transit camp Martin Bargush and the port of Mersa Matra, 240 kilometers west of Alexandria and 222 kilometers east of Sollum, which sits on the border of Egypt and Libya, and dug in to prepare for the upcoming onslaught. Rommel would take Sollum at the end of April, but would go no further because Tobruk stayed in Allied hands and would be so for the next 8 months. As a result, he could go no further eastward as his supply lines were overextended and were forced to travel inland to avoid the coastal road, which was the same reason General Wavell instructed Tobruk's capture back in 1940. As a result, Rommel was hesitant to continue pushing further east in case the Allied troops at Tobruk, being supported by Captain Hector MacDonald Waller's Scrap Island Flotilla and the Royal Navy, managed to break out. This inability to capture Tobruk meant that Rommel also had supply problems for units near Sollum on the Libyan-Egyptian border, as they were end of an extended supply line that stretched all the way back to Tripoli. Anzac Day commemorations for the battalion were subdued as they manned their weapons as the battalion experienced their first enemy air raid, while most of the casualties were sustained by British anti-aircraft guns. A lot of the injuries that fell on the battalion were due to the shrapnel from the guns firing on the aircraft. The men of the 2nd 14th dug into the line, preparing minefields, camouflaging their positions, and receiving instructions on how to make and use Molotov cocktails using whatever ingredient and empty bottle they had on hand, which apparently was quite a few. While there, they routinely were informed about the conditions at Tobruk, and according to the unit diary, morale would improve with each report. The 2nd 14th waited for the upcoming German blitzkrieg, except that it never came, thanks to the rats of Tobruk continuing to hold Tobruk harbour and frustrate the Axis powers. That frustration allowed the Allies a chance to breathe, as the air, land and sea forces of the Allies in the Mediterranean and North African theatres had been mauled following the fighting in Greece, Crete and Rommel's initial eastward advance. At the start of 1941, General Wavell and the Allies experienced a measure of success, and by March, he could call on 10 Allied divisions comprising of British, Australian, Indian, New Zealand and South African units, as well as supported by several smaller African territorial divisions. However, 2 months later, following the disastrous campaigns in Greece and Crete and the collapse of Italian forces in North Africa, half of these divisions, which comprised of the most experienced and battle-hardened half, were either broken up into smaller units or were in the process of recovering, reinforcing and rearming after their evacuations from Greece and Crete. Of the remaining 5 divisions, the 9th Division was holding the line at Tobruk and was effectively cut off. 3 others were assisting Rommel on the border, supported by smaller territorial divisions, and an Indian division operating in Abyssinia, completing mop-up operations. This actually left the 7th Australian Division as the sole substantial and ready reserve for the entirety of the North African campaign. The air and sea forces available to Middle Eastern Command were also severely weakened due to the Greece and Crete campaigns. They lacked sufficient planes or boats to supply and reinforce Tobruk and Malta, and as well as conducting offensive operations against the Axis raiders or to contest the German air superiority over the Mediterranean. Adding to Wavell's concerns was the pressure of Vichy French-controlled Syria and Lebanon on the northern border of British-mandated territories. After the First World War, the Sykes-Picot Agreement led to the division of the Ottoman Empire, with Britain controlling modern-day Iraq, Palestine and Transjordan, while France controlled Lebanon, Alexandria, and southern Anatolia. During the interwar period, both nations ended up granting selective autonomy to the portions of these mandates. Now, following the Nazi defeat of French forces in 1940, France signed an armistice that divided the country into 2 zones, the German-occupied north and west, and an unoccupied southern zone governed by the Vichy government under Marshal Philippe Pétain, a French war hero. Although Vichy France claimed neutrality, it openly collaborated with the Nazis, enforcing authoritarian rule and anti-Semitic laws. Additionally, Vichy France maintained control over most of France's overseas territories, which routinely posed a strategic issue for the Allies, mainly due to the proximity of these territories to British-controlled interests. The Vichy regime's pro-German stance caused concern for General Wavell, who feared that the Axis powers might use Vichy-controlled Syria and Lebanon to launch attacks on the Suez Canal or the strategically vital oil fields of British-mandated Iraq and Persia, modern-day Iran, much as Ottoman forces had threatened the Suez Canal in the previous war by attacking across the Sinai Desert. Despite Vichy France's supposed neutrality, Wavell recognized that he would most likely need to commit forces to invade Syria and Lebanon in the near future, as he planned operations in the Western Desert and in Greece. With the 7th Australian Division as the only available reserve, in May 1941, Lieutenant General John Dudley Laverick, the commander of the 7th Australian Division, was informed that he needed to relocate back to Palestine to prepare for operations in Syria, even as his division held defensive positions in case Rommel managed to break through the Allied defensive line at Sollum. On the 22nd of May, Roberts and the rest of the 2nd 14th were relieved by the South African Division and instructed to head first to Moascar Isolation Camp before boarding trains to return to Palestine, arriving there on the 26th and entered camp near Nazareth, eventually entering positions at Kefer Gidon, where apparently there were forests of eucalypt trees which reminded the men of home. The invasion of Vichy-controlled Syria is probably the least known Australian operation in the Second World War, owing primarily to the fact that it took place in the shadow of the Greece campaign and as the siege of Tobruk was taking place. It called for a 3-pronged advance. Initially, the 21st Australian Brigade, comprising of the 2nd 14th, would advance north from Palestine along the Lebanese coast, heading to Beirut. The 25th Australian Brigade was bound for Rayak and the airfields. The 5th Indian Brigade and Free French forces under General Charles de Gaulle advanced for Damascus. Once these objectives were taken, the second phase would commence, the capture of Tripoli, Homs, and Palmyra. On the eve of the invasion, Private Claude Roberts would go AWOL on the night of the 1st of June and was confined to barracks for 1 day. The invasion began on the night of the 7th of June, under the ill-informed assumption that the Vichy French forces would step aside and only offer token resistance. That was not to be, brought on by the strong propaganda campaign from the Vichy government within France, encouraging the people to fight the quote-unquote hereditary enemy, namely Britain, and equating the defense of Syria as a matter of national honour. The fighting was fierce, but progress was slow and steady, with Meragedon captured on the 11th of June and Sidon being captured on the 15th. The mountainous terrain, however, made the rapid advance a doubtful prospect, and by the 12th of June it was decided to transfer a bulk of the forces from the central inland route to the coastal advance. The most rapid progress was actually made by the Indians and Free French forces towards Damascus. On the 14th of June, the Vichy forces launched a counterattack on both the 25th Brigade and the Indian and Free French forces. They recaptured the towns of Ezra, Kunitara, and Merjayan, but by the 18th of June, the situation had been restored, with all but Merjayan back in Allied hands. The Allied emphasis then switched to the capture of Damascus, which fell on the 21st of June. On that day, a mixed force of British troops, including the Arab Legion, entered Syria from Iraq and advanced on Palmyra, reaching it on the 25th, but Vichy forces kept the British at bay for 9 days before finally surrendering. After the capture of Damascus, the mainly Australian drive on Beirut became the Allied main effort. Pressure was maintained around Jazin by the 25th Brigade, while the 21st, reinforced by the 17th Brigade from the 6th Division, drove north and along the coast. The climactic battle of the campaign was fought to secure Darmour between the 5th and 9th of July when it was captured. There was little progress on the western sectors, and attention was then concentrated on the Jazin and coastal areas. British forces headed north to Beirut on the 10th of July, with the Australians within 10 kilometres of Beirut, the British 4th Cavalry Brigade closing on Homs and the 10th Indian Division having advanced northern Syria from Iraq. The Vichy French commander, General Henry Dentz, sought an armistice. A ceasefire was arranged and it began 1 minute after midnight on the 12th of July 1941. 2 days later, the armistice was signed at Acre. Australian casualties during the fighting in Syria and Lebanon numbered 416 killed and 1,136 wounded. Approximately 1,000 Vichy French troops were killed throughout the theatre. Following the armistice, the 21st Brigade and Private Roberts underwent garrison duties along the Lebanese coast, where he celebrated his birthday with a large fruitcake sent to him from a friend back in Melbourne. While in garrison, he wrote Maudie on the 23rd of July. As reporting of the invasion in Syria had now reached Australian shores, he was free to tell her of his time there, and that due to the fighting, he and the rest of the battalion were now enjoying a period of rest, including a trip to Beirut, which he equated to being like Melbourne, and that he had postcards to send, but as they had been sent by sea, they might not arrive for some time. While in garrison, the chief task of the 2nd 14th was reparation of captured French soldiers back to France, and in September, the battalion was transferred to the north of Lebanon near Tripoli, where they set up defensive positions in the north, where they stayed as part of the garrison in Syria and Lebanon until early January 1942, in case Turkey, who had signed a pro-German pact, decided to enter the war. A week before Japan's devastating entry into the Second World War, with the simultaneous attacks on Malaya, Pearl Harbor, Guam, Hong Kong, Singapore, and the Philippines, Roberts would go AWOL again, this time for a day, and as a punishment he would receive 14 days confinement to barracks and fined 1 day's pay. Following Japan's introduction to the war on the 11th of January, the 7th Division received orders to return to Palestine and set up camp near Jerusalem. A little over a fortnight later, the battalion boarded trucks for the journey back to the Suez Canal, arriving the following day. They spent the night in a transit camp before boarding the troop ship HMT Ile-de-France, finally departing the North African theatre on the 30th of January as part of Operation Stepsister. I kid you not, that's what the actual codename is for the operation to bring the Australian 6th and 7th Divisions home. Originally, they would have been sent to reinforce the garrisons at Singapore and the Dutch territories of Sumatra and Java. The 9th Division would not be sent to the Pacific until the end of 1943 as part of the arrangement to allow the 6th and 7th Divisions to return home. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill argued that the now famous Ratsuta Brook was still needed strategically for the upcoming battles in El Alamein, and Australia's Prime Minister John Curtin reluctantly consented to this, but only after the United States President Franklin D. Roosevelt agreed to divert more American servicemen to bolster Australia, and Churchill promised to increase the Royal Australian Air Force to 73 operational squadrons. 6 days after departing Egypt, the convoy put into Bombay Harbour on the 8th of February. The battalion disembarked and marched into the Colbar camp for 3 days, before boarding the transport ship HMT City of Paris, heading out to sea on the 13th. There purely had to be a coincidence there. While they were at sea, Singapore would fall, and Allied assessments on the situation at Java and Sumatra was that they could no longer be held. It would seem that fate had intervened for Roberts and the rest of the 7th Division. Sadly, the same was not true for their brother soldiers in the 8th Division, who became prisoners of war. The fall of Singapore and Java and Sumatra galvanised Curtin, and guided by his cabinet, cabled Churchill to reiterate that all troop ships en route must be diverted to Australia and the 9th Division must be brought home, quote, at an early date, unquote. As the troops were still at sea, it was then suggested to instead send them to the Australian divisions to Rangoon, the capital of Burma, and in a surprising and controversial move, Churchill instructed the British Admiralty, who was overseeing the transport of the Australian divisions, to redirect the convoys to Rangoon, the capital of Burma, without telling Curtin. This move resulted in the convoy containing the 2nd 14th transiting the equator 3 times, though I am not entirely sure if they conducted Neptune's court every single time. I'm fairly certain the ceremony would go tiresome after the second crossing. Curtin and his war cabinet were shocked and outraged by this. Churchill had overstepped his bounds. The following day, after this declaration was uncovered, Curtin responded with a firm demand that the soldiers be returned to Australia immediately. Churchill, apparently recognising the gravity of the situation and realising he'd overstepped, conceded, and the ships once more changed course and continued on to Australia. 2 days later, the convoy put into Colombo on the 25th to take on provisions before departing 3 days later, heading south, finally bound for home. HMT City of Paris would reach Fremantle, Western Australia on the 15th of March, with leave granted as the ship took on provisions and offloaded those units aboard destined to remain in Western Australia, namely Matron Kathleen Best's 2nd 5th Australian General Hospital, before the ship itself continued on to Port Adelaide 2 days later with the 2nd 14th. On the 23rd of March, they put into Port Adelaide, South Australia, and the following day the battalion marched ashore and into the Springbank camp in Mitcham. From there, it was training and leave until the 15th of April, when the unit was relocated by train to Melbourne and the Glen Innes training camp, where the men were granted home leave and reinforcements were taken on strength. Once the men returned from leave, they were back aboard trains, bound for jungle and mountain training and defensive duties around Yandina on the Sunshine Coast of Queensland as they prepared to head to New Guinea. While Claude Roberts had been in the Middle East with the 6th, 7th and 9th Divisions, the defence of Australia initially fell to the 8th Division and the militia, which comprised of 2 cavalry divisions and 4.5 infantry divisions, or the equivalent of what Australia fielded in the previous war. Now, while on paper that was impressive, however, as priority had been given to the forces in North Africa in terms of leadership, manpower, and material, there was a critical shortage of any of this in the Pacific Campaign, which only exacerbated when the 8th Division was lost following the surrender of Singapore. This meant that the defence of Australia, until the AIF divisions arrived, comprised of men who were either too old or too young, or otherwise unfit to serve in the AIF, with the equipment deemed not suitable enough to be taken overseas. If these handicaps weren't bad enough, the men of the militia also had to contend with the stigma of being referred to as Choco, short by chocolate soldiers by the men of the AIF. The term originates from George Bernard Shaw's 1894 play Arms and the Man, and referred to a soldier who would not fight but looked pretty good in a uniform. And for the militia, this came from the fact that while they did receive a higher rate of pay to the men of the AIF and had all the trappings of soldiers, due to the restrictions of Section 51 of the 1903 Defence Act prohibiting them from leaving Australia and her territories, inferred that they were simply for show, and if they actually did have to fight, they would melt under the pressure. As the Japanese advanced southward in early 1942, their goal was to isolate Australia by capturing Port Moresby in New Guinea and a strategic location for launching operations in Timor Strait. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander, Allied Forces Southwest Pacific, recognising the threat, was determined to hold Port Moresby at all costs, relying on militia forces until the veteran 6th and 7th Divisions were ready to re-enter the fight. In April, Japan launched Operation Mo, which was a 4-pronged attempt to seize Port Moresby by land and sea. While initially successful in securing key islands, the Japanese were forced to abandon their amphibious assault after suffering losses during the battles of the Coral Sea on the 4th to 8th of May and the Battle of Midway on the 6th and 8th of June. After which, Japan attempted landings at Buna in early July and Milne Bay in August, aiming to approach Port Moresby overland. Despite routing the small Allied force at Buna, the Japanese faced their first major land defeat in Milne Bay, largely in the hands of militiamen. Before these invasions, General Sir Thomas Blamey, commander of Australian forces, acting on advice from MacArthur, had ordered an offensive to secure Kokoda, a vital post in the only airfield within the Air Islands interior. The task of crossing the Owen Stanley Ranges along the Kokoda Trail, a challenging and unmapped route, fell to Captain Sam Templeton and the inexperienced 39th Militia Battalion. Japanese forces landed at Gona on the 21st of July and advanced inland and clashed with Australian troops 3 days later. Despite reinforcements, the Australians, facing difficult conditions and a stretched supply line, were forced to withdraw to Isarava after a failed attempt to recapture Kokoda, which had been taken by the Japanese on the 8th of August. Fortunately, the United States Marine landings at Guadalcanal on the 7th of August and the consolidation of Japanese positions at Kokoda allowed the Allies a chance once again to catch their breath. What happened with the 39th Militia Battalion is covered in my episodes on Ralph Honor, who was ordered to proceed to Port Moresby to assume command of the 39th on the 1st of August, and embarked 2 days later for New Guinea. For the 21st Brigade and the 2nd 14th, their orders would arrive the day after Honor's, and the battalion would board the SS James Fenimore Cooper. With them was the new commanding officer of the Maroubra Force, Brigadier General Arnold Potts, and their orders were to proceed at speed to New Guinea. Putting into Port Moresby on the 13th of August 1942, the brigade would be loaded onto trucks 3 days later at Elio for marching into Uberai. Brigadier Potts informed Honor that relief was on its way, and the 2nd 14th would lead that relief, with C Company being sent to Isarava, reaching there on the 26th of August. B and D, along with Roberts, would be sent to Alola to reinforce the decimated 53rd Militia Battalion, and A Company was sent to Templeton's Crossing. On the 27th of August, D Company, 2nd 14th, facing heavy rain, linked up with B and E Companies of the 39th Battalion and entered the line in support of the quote-unquote killing field through which any Japanese thrust up the valley towards Isarava would have to traverse. And the following day, they replaced E Company in the line to give the beleaguered 39th Battalion men a chance for a much-needed breather. The arrival of the 2nd 14th greatly impressed Ralph Honor and the men of the 39th, as from the 27th to the 30th of August 1942, they took on the primary defensive positions at Isarava. They had then held the line against, quote, an awesome volume of mountain gun, mortar, and machine gun fire, unquote. That was accompanied by, quote, wave upon wave of infantry attacks that brought them to within savage close quarters fighting and numerous acts of incredible bravery, unquote. Honor's adjutant, Lieutenant Keith Lovett, summed it up, quote, they handled the walk over Kokoda Trail very well. They weren't dragging the chain when they got to us. When you're lying in the mud and you see these blokes walk up and they're fit and they look big and confident, then they said, well, we'll fix this mob up. We just told them, you're welcome. We're glad you've arrived. We desperately need help. And they said, we'll give it to you. And they did, unquote. Unfortunately, that help would come at a cost. When the 2nd 14th arrived at Uberai, they had 546 officers and men, and when they were finally replaced in reserve, they only had 88 men available, of which only 3 were officers. 110 men would be killed on and around the Kokoda Trail, and one of these would be Private Claude Herbert Roberts. Initially listed as missing in action in October 1942, this was changed to killed in action on the 18th of March 1943 and backdated to the 30th of August, when his remains were discovered by Australian forces making their way back up the Kokoda Trail. He was initially buried at the Aurora Creek Military Cemetery on the 22nd of May 1943. After the war, he was exhumed and reburied at the Bomana War Cemetery in Port Moresby under the inscription chosen by his grieving family, quote, always remembered, unquote. He was 30 years old. He's also commemorated on the Mulwala Honour Roll, the Savernake and District World War II Roll of Honour, and on panel 38 of the Roll of Honour of the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. And there you have it, folks. That is the life, service, and legacy of Private Leopold Claude Herbert Roberts. It has been my pleasure to bring Claude back to Christine and her family, and it is a fitting reminder that those aren't just names etched in stone. They're stories of service and sacrifice that sometimes become lost and separated in the ether of time, but fate and circumstance sometimes bring these stories back home to those who hold them dear. Claude's legacy and those like him live not only just in official records and honor rolls, but in the hearts of those who remember him. It's through these personal connections, these rediscovered memories, that we ensure their sacrifice is never forgotten. Works cited in this episode are the collected letters of Claude Herbert Roberts, collated and transcribed by Christine Wilton with the assistance of her daughter Kayla. The unit diaries of the 2nd 14th Australian Infantry Battalion and the 21st Infantry Brigade. Trove, the online newspaper archived by the National Library of Australia. The Victorian and New South Wales Departments of Births, Deaths and Marriages. The National Archive of Australia. The service record of Claude Herbert Roberts. The 2nd 14th Association website. The Oz at War website. The website of the Shrine of Remembrance. The Virtual War Memorial of Australia, the Struggle for North Africa 1940-1943 by the National Army Museum, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, the Department of Veteran Affairs Second World War Nominal Roll, Ralph Honor, Kokoda Hero by Peter Brune, The Good Soldier by Field Marshal Earl Wavell, He's Not Coming South, The Invasion That Wasn't by Peter Stanley, The Australian Militia at War 1939-1945 by James Morrison, The Making and Breaking of the Post-Federation Australian Army 1901 by 1909 by Craig Stockings, The National Film and Sound Archive, the official history of Australia's involvement in the War of 1939-1945, Series 1 Land, and the website of the Australian War Memorial. I Was Only Doing My Job, and an Australian Military History podcast is made possible thanks to the generous support from each and every one of you, but especially to the members of our Armoured Emu Brigade community. Now, if you want to continue the conversation or suggest the topic for a future episode, you can do so on all our social media channels. At this point, the podcast is on everything under @IWODMJ. Links to everything are in the show description. If you want to join the Armoured Emu Brigade community, you can also do so on our Discord server. The invite link to that is on the episode description and on the podcast website, www.thecnetwork.net. There you can find also show notes, transcripts, and photos of my various travels that are locating the myriad of memorials dotted around Australia. If you like what I do here on the podcast and want to directly support the work that I do, you can either buy the podcast a one-off coffee or support us on Patreon for exclusive podcasts, interviews, and giveaways. Each cent raised goes directly into improving the podcast, from digitization of service records and the purchasing of reference material to the distribution and licensing of each and every piece of content. But the best thing you can do is rate this episode on your platform of choice, leave a review, or share it with a friend. It's the easiest way to show your support and get the show into the ears of people who need to hear it. Thanks for listening to I Was Only Doing My Job, an Australian Military History podcast, a Doc Network production. This episode was recorded on the lands of the Ngunnawal people, whose elders have passed on knowledge for thousands of years, and we pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. This podcast is mostly a one-man show, with me doing the writing, researching, recording, audio engineering, and directing, with additional research done by Laurie Favell of My Silent Hero. All opinions expressed in this episode are solely those of the speaker and do not represent the opinions or views of any agency, entity, or organization. It is licensed under Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share Alike 4.0 International License. And until next time, friends, catch you then. Bye.